Good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in to our sixth debate of term. Relationships between the four nations of the United Kingdom are collectively more strained than they have been in a century. The Irish question in trade deal negotiations with the EU has proved fractious. Welsh national sentiment appears to be on the rise. And we have the Scottish elections coming up in May, which could see more pledges made for Scottish independence. Will the United Kingdom survive the next decade, or will it splinter beyond repair? These are the topics we will be discussing tonight with our motion, "This House believes the Kingdom is no longer united." On this call to debate the issue tonight, we have not 4 but 6 eminent guest speakers. There's been a lot of engagement on social media, so I hope plenty of you in the audience will get involved by sending in any questions or points of information you have in response to the speeches you hear in our debate. You can do this by following the link in the description below. Please remember, as ever, we will be voting at the end of tonight's event. The poll is linked below, and you can use this as an opportunity to decide whether you agree with this motion, despise it, or for whatever nuanced reason, feel the need to abstain. Now, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker for the proposition. Our first speaker is Ian Blackford. Ian is the MP for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, and the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party in Westminster. Prior to engaging in politics, he had a 20-year career in finance, which included stints at NatWest and Deutsche Bank. Ian, you have our ears. You'll have to unmute, sorry.
Apologies. Let me begin by thanking the organisers for this kind invitation. I know that this has been an especially difficult time to be a student and sustain everything that makes student life so special. So I think it's all more important and commendable that the Cambridge Union has tried hard to keep public debate alive during these most difficult of times. Like the rest of the contributors, I would love to have been participating in person, and hopefully that day will not be too far away. So, turning to the case for the proposition tonight that the Kingdom is no longer united. Last Friday evening, as my thoughts turned towards this debate, my arguments were happily assisted when news began emerging of the latest Downing Street infighting and resignations. The taxpayer-funded union unit has now had 2 different heads, followed by 2 resignations, all in the space of 2 weeks, and now we understand that there's going to be a new cabinet committee. Making the case for a disunited kingdom becomes all the more obvious and self-evident when the Prime Minister's own union unit is so crippled by division. Even I felt a bit of sympathy for the next person who's asked to take on the poison challenge the head of this unit for how long that person might remain in place. But it would be all too easy to center the case for the proposition on, as one government source described it, a never-ending psychodrama at 10 Downing Street. In truth, the crisis that the union and unionism faces is much wider and goes far deeper. Since I have limited time, let me focus on just 2 areas that I think crystallise the constitutional change that's now underway, certainly from a Scottish perspective. The first and chief amongst the division at the heart of the union remains the Brexit referendum result and the type of extreme Brexit which has now been implemented. Brexit was a moment of true change across these islands because it is a moment of lasting change. Breaking away from the European Union and the economic and social choices that flow from it is now an ever-shifting water table beneath all our feet. It is unsettling all of the political ground which rests upon it. A typical and tried attack on my own party is often that our only objective and instinct is to cause division. That attack line is now more than slightly ironic, because it was not my party's choice, nor that of the Scottish people, which enabled the breakup from the benefits of the European project. Scotland did not give our consent to this breakup. In fact, our people in the actual referendum and in every election since have rejected both the people and the vision behind it. And that is why it's so important, because this argument is much more than purely economic. The founding values of the European Union, human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and respect for human rights, are Scotland's values. Over our nearly 50 years of membership, we've benefited enormously from the single market's 4 freedoms, including freedom of movement. Simon, are you wishing to come in on that point? No, you're just waving. My apologies.
I think Christine wanted to come in.
Christine, in you come.
Thank you. I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, but I'm curious. He is reciting the benefits of union. He's reciting the benefits of being a member and sharing sovereignty with the European Union. Why then is it unacceptable to be a member of an economic union with the rest of the United Kingdom and share sovereignty with them.
We're not against an economic union with those that we share these islands with. In fact, we would actually like to see a continuance of a social and economic union. But the fact is, if I can say to the honourable member, what's happened is that we've been taking out the largest union that exists in the Western world, one where there's a collaboration of peoples, where we willingly pool sovereignty, and that's the difference. Because as we all know, that we've just come through a period where we've debated, amongst other things, the UK Single Market Act, which gives power, gives competence over devolved areas to the Westminster Parliament. And rather than seeing, as we've had with funding from Europe, when it's a partnership, it's collaboration, the UK is giving itself powers to intervene directly, whether that's in infrastructure or in many other areas of our domestic life. But let me come back to the issues of Europe. And as I mentioned, over 50 years of membership, we've benefited enormously from the single market's 4 freedoms, including freedom of movement. More than 230,000 people from across Europe have made Scotland their home. They are part of who we are. They're our friends and family, and we really want them to stay. Brexit also means our people will be less safe, and the right to work, study and live elsewhere in Europe will be restricted. And the rights and freedoms that my generation had to live and work in Europe, I worked in Europe, my son worked in Europe, is now going to be taken away from the next generation as a right. And I grieve that. I grieve what that means. And of course, that loss includes Erasmus, which saw more than 2,000 Scottish students, staff and learners use the scheme each year. All of these losses as a result of Brexit we didn't vote for undermines a long historical belonging. Because it shouldn't be forgotten that Scotland was European before it was British. Asking the Scottish people to sacrifice those common European values is asking us to sacrifice a fundamental part of who we are. That is why we're so determined to find our way back to those ideals, to these values and to that future. Ultimately, I do think the clear crisis for union boils down to these core arguments. Because while there's been plenty of complexity through the Brexit shambles, beneath that complexity there remains one simple fact. The future voted for by the Scottish people is not compatible with the future that we're now being offered within the United Kingdom. It is not compatible with the future being imposed upon us precisely because we endorsed a very different future. A growing majority of the Scottish people are now seeking a new independent future that offers our people so much more than Brexit Britain ever could. For some, the clarity of the choice has perhaps become stronger because of Brexit, but the roots of division in the Union, I think, run far deeper. So let me turn to a second area where I believe has caused disunity in the United Kingdom. In this, the week before the UK budget, it is important to say that the divergence or division in the Union isn't simply or solely a product of the constitutional upheavals that have been going on in more recent years. For Scotland, the choice of independence and the growing support for it is equally a result of our bitter experience of a broken Westminster system, which made the political choice to enforce an austerity agenda over the course of the last decade. We have majored on monetary policy and ignored our responsibilities to create fiscal stimulus. That political choice of austerity was devastating at the time, and its legacy is still every bit as damaging today. The legacy of cuts and the resultant inequalities will only get worse with the long-term damage of Brexit, which has already cost Scotland's economy more than £3.9 billion and is set to leave every person, on average, £1,600 worse off. For Scottish businesses, Brexit also means more costs, red tape and barriers to trade, and that hits all our businesses and communities. We were often told about the sea of opportunity for our fishing communities. Well, it's been a harsh reality, and actually in many of the species which are caught by Scottish fishermen, take cod and haddock in the North Sea, their quotas are lower. And as we've seen over the course of the last few weeks, Scottish shellfish producers have been cut off from their markets. That's the reality that we're now living with. Against its will, and in the middle of the pandemic and economic recession, Scotland has been removed from a market worth $16 billion in exports to Scottish companies, and which by population is 7 times the size of the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, there seems to be no end to these disruptive economic choices that have been consistently opposed by the Scottish Government and by the people of Scotland. Rather than emerging from this pandemic with an investment-led recovery, just as we're seeing, for example, with Biden in the US, all the signs and signals ahead of next week's budget point to a Tory Chancellor returning to type. For months now, Rishi Sunak has been preparing the ground for a return to a conservative austerity agenda rather than making the progressive choices of investing in growth. After enforcing a decade of austerity and devastating Brexit, the Tories are threatening to repeat the same old failed economics. And the harsh reality of that is simply what we see with the food bank use. And I have to say, the figures that we're now beginning to see over the course of the last year is there's been an alarming increase in the use of food banks, a real signal of the financial pain that many families, many children are seeing. So another powerful reason as to why the union is divided is the growing belief that Scotland's economic interests are no longer served by being part of this union. Let me finish on this point. Although I make the case for the proposition that the kingdom is no longer united, I do hope and believe that we can reach a point whereby we leave behind the chaos and crisis that have defined this period of our politics. Because though unionism may scorn this, the idea of Scottish independence has never been about separatism. It is instead about the basic right of people to decide the form of government that best suits their needs. Rather than the instability and limitations offered by the UK, an independent country now offers the Scottish people both stability and opportunity through self-governance. As an independent member of the European Union, Scotland may be a partner and a bridge builder, not just a bridge to building a stronger economy and fairer society, but a bridge to an aid to understanding between the UK and the European Union. Because we are comfortable with multiple identities, and the other countries of the UK will always be not just our closest neighbours, but our closest friends as well. There is a future beyond the current division and disunity, but it requires those in Downing Street and a Prime Minister raging against democracy to respect the right of the people to choose our own future. And I will say to my colleagues and friends on the other side that that debate on Scotland's future is going to come. And the one hope I have for all of us is that all of us are respectful in that debate to the opinions of others. I'm not saying, and I never would say, that we have all the answers to all the problems that confront us. But I do want us to have a debate about what is the best opportunity for Scotland, and for all of us to respect the breadth and the extent of opinions in that. But for the time being, I'm happy to propose the motion to the House. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your speech. We have two points of information which were raised during that, one from Andrew and one from Ian, and we also have a student question. So I might take Andrew's question next, just because Ian, you're next in line of speaking. So Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you. I thank the honourable member for his opening speech and his defence of the proposition and the motion this evening. He spoke quite a bit about the economic uncertainty caused by Brexit, and I completely understand his position and respect his opposition to Conservative Party economic policy. But it's simply uncredible, I would put to him, that there would be no economic upheaval or uncertainty caused by the disruption which would emanate from a vote for Scotland to leave the rest of the United Kingdom. And to claim that there would be none is simply to pull the wool over people's eyes. And actually, I think people deserve better. If we're going to have this debate, we should actually be truthful about what would happen in the case of an independence vote. And the economic upheaval would be huge. In fact, actually, it would dwarf any of the economic problems caused by our leaving the European Union.
I really look forward to having this debate with Andrew and with others over the coming period. It's an important subject, and let me thank Andrew for the way he's put the question. You know, I would simply say to Andrew that I think as part of the Union, you could take any decade over the course of the last 100 odd years, that Scotland has underachieved its potential, and that's probably best described by the decline in our relative population share. There's something which has happened. I'm not blaming anybody for that. That's just the kind of harsh reality of where we are. I do think, Andrew, that there's got to be a change to the priorities for our economy. And I think there is a challenge, which I will admit that is not just faced by us, but is faced by many people. And that is how we drive investment into the economy, how we drive up productivity, how we drive up living standards. And I think the fact remains is that there are a lot of ingredients in Scotland that will allow us to do that. We need to make sure that Scotland becomes a destination. We need to suck in people. We need to suck in capital. We need also, as part of that, to make sure that we invest in skills and education. Education is vitally important as part of that. But we have to raise people's aspirations. And I'm happy to have a broader debate about this in a wider sense. I mean, I spoke about in my speech about what's happening in North America, what's happened with Biden. And I do feel that when I look at what's happened over the course of the last 10 years, that a lot of the monetary policy initiatives, the QE programme, of course it was necessary, but there's been a lack of balance about how we create sustainable economic growth as part of that, about driving the investment into the economy to make sure that we're ready for the desire that we all have to get to a greener future. But those ingredients that we would have as an independent Scotland being part of Europe means that we would be able to accelerate that. I'm not saying, never would I say, that independence is a land of milk and honey. Of course it's not. There are a lot of challenges that we would face, and I never want to over-dramatise and say that we will solve all of Scotland's problems on day one. We won't. There'll be a lot of hard work. But what I want to do, Andrew, if we are successful in this, I want for there to be a place for you, for Ian, for Christine to engage in the debate, to be part of this. We need to take people with us. We need to create that unity if Scotland ends up going down that journey. And let's make sure that all of us working together can create that better future that I know that we all want.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Ian. We have one question from the audience, which is a point of information, which I wondered if, Ian, you could just clarify. But if you could keep your response brief, that would be fantastic. So this question is from Ewan Woods. Ewan says, wasn't Brexit an already acknowledged possibility prior to the independence referendum when David Cameron made his first announcement of the Brexit referendum in 2013? What do you have to say to this?
Well, I think the fact was that many people told us in the independence campaign in 2014, if we wanted to secure our rights as European citizens, that we had to stay in the UK. Now, I mean, whether any of us like it or not, it is the case that many people have changed their opinion on Scottish independence and been taken out of Europe. And there is that very strong Remain vote. Many of us here that are speaking tonight were Remainers, and some still are Remainers. And there's a very strong expression of opinion that people want the right to have their say on their future now that we've been taken out of Europe against our will. And many people do grieve for the reasons that I said. What happened to us, Freddie?
Thank you very much, Ian, for your clarification. Right, we will move on to our first speaker for the opposition tonight, who is also called Ian, so we can tell that this is clearly a Celtic debate tonight. Ian Murray is our next speaker. Ian is the MP for Edinburgh South and has served as the Shadow Secretary for Scotland since April this year. He is a vocal opponent of Scottish independence and was critical of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. Ian, you have our ears.
Well, Mr. President, thank you very much indeed. And thank you. I agree with Ian for one thing tonight. Thank you for organising this and thank you for putting it together. And I hope everyone who's a member of the union, a member of the club, is managing to cope with what's happened. It's really hit young people and students very, very hard indeed. And hopefully we're coming out the end of that now and we can all get together very soon for two reasons. One, so we can do this in person. But secondly, I think you owe us a drink and something to eat, Freddie, after us doing this on Zoom. We're buying our own food and drinks tonight, which is a proposition that I would always disagree with. Let me tell you why I'm against the proposition. And you'll hear a lot tonight, and you have heard a lot already from Ian of Tory government bashing, and they absolutely deserve it. You know, we've got the mess of Brexit, and incidentally, the same arguments that Ian was just using against the proposition of Brexit are exactly the same arguments he uses to promote independence, and Brexit and Skexit are two of exactly the same things. You'll hear a lot about the Tories' disastrous handling of COVID, which again is justifiable, of austerity, which you heard from Ian, of their dodgy crony contracts, of £2 billion going to friends, family and neighbours, the massive increase in poverty and inequality. You'll hear all of that. The charge sheet is lengthy and deservedly lengthy, and Ian gave a tour de force of how that charge sheet is lengthy. But you can't confuse the current incumbents of Downing Street with the country. It would be wrong to say that the Tories are the UK as much as it would be to say Nicola Sturgeon is Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon is not Scotland and Boris Johnson is not United Kingdom, and for that matter, and we might hear this from David, that Mark Drakeford is not Wales. And I would argue it's the Tories and the status quo that is broken and not the United Kingdom, and there's a great unity across these four nations. I fundamentally believe in the UK, and it's not a fundamental belief because I think that the Union Jack is the best flag in the world, or you know, the Queen or the institutions that the United Kingdom holds dear. It's because it's in the best interests of everyone who lives on these islands and everyone who's patriotic about the four nations of these islands that can work together, that makes the union endure. And you don't need to listen to the nationalists in terms of the arguments that they will make. Ian will find any grievance to try and break up the United Kingdom because, to be fair to Ian, that's what he lives for. His entire raison d'etre is to break up the United Kingdom. If it wasn't Brexit or austerity, it would be the colour of my tie, it would be the colour of the Prime Minister's hair. It doesn't really matter. They would find any grievance in terms of breaking up the United Kingdom. And what I was very disappointed about, Mr. President, was that Ian gave a very gentle and a very inclusive speech there about nationalism, but still doesn't answer any of the questions that everyone requires in order to be able to determine whether or not Scotland should be pulling itself out of the United Kingdom, wrenching itself out of the United Kingdom. I think wrenching's the word that Ian and his colleagues use in terms of the European Union. He doesn't tell us any of those big questions. He hasn't told us tonight, and maybe he could intervene on me now and ask for a point of information and tell us what the currency would be. Ian used to work in the city, a distinguished banker, not just a poor crofter, a distinguished banker, and hasn't told us what the currency would be. He hasn't told us what the accession to the European Union would be. His colleague Jean Freeman claims that the border between Scotland and England in a post-Scottish independent state would not be the trade agreement that's just been signed with the EU, which it would be. Nothing about borders, nothing about the fact that the entirety of the proposition of setting up an independent Scotland was on an oil price of $114 a barrel. I'm sure there's lots of economists in your Cambridge Debating Society, Mr. President, that could give you the price of a barrel of oil over the last 6 or 7 years and potentially project that for the next 10 or 20, and it would be probably less than half that. There has been nothing in terms of the successes of the United Kingdom, one of the most successful unions in the world, 300 years it's been together by putting these nations together. And I really disagree with the proposition Ian puts together that Scotland has never, over the last 100 years, prospered in any decade because of being part of the United Kingdom. These are all just nationalist arguments. And I think what we really need to be doing is a number of things. So my argument isn't about defending the status quo. It's not about defending the Tories as Ian would like to portray it as. It's about saying that, yes, the Tories are broken. Yes, the status quo is broken, but the response to that isn't to defend the broken status quo or to separate the United Kingdom and rip it apart, but to reimagine it, to re-engineer it, to put together the best bits, to celebrate what we do well together, to look at the things that we can do in terms of inequality and in terms of bringing people together, to tackle poverty in Devon as you would tackle it in the northeast or the northwest of Scotland, where Ian Blackford is from. We can all be hugely patriotic. I want Scotland to go to Wembley in June in the European Championships and win 10-0, and I'll be the first person to be dancing around the streets in my kilt, waving the saltire. That's patriotism, but it's not nationalism. And one of the strengths of the UK, of course, is the 4 nations of the UK are incredibly patriotic. The English, the Welsh, the Irish, the Scots are incredibly patriotic. But we can all put that patriotism aside to keep our economic, social and cultural United Kingdom together. And the way I think we should be reimagining the United Kingdom is to do what we did in the mid-1990s when we brought devolution, is to reimagine devolution for the mid-2020s in terms of getting power out of the broken status quo, reimagining the United Kingdom away from the status quo and pushing power closer to the people with subsidiarity at the heart of it. We've got to articulate the purpose and positives of the UK. And let me just give you some of the positives. The vaccine. I'm sorry to say, Oxford University, with our big pharmaceutical companies, working with government, working with our big national institution, the NHS, created by the United Kingdom. A Welsh MP created the NHS with a Labour government after the Second World War, where all the nations worked together. Let's articulate those positives. The vaccine's a big one. COVID is a massive one, using the strength of the United Kingdom to pool and share those resources to ensure that nobody's left behind and the support's in place. We could all argue that it's not enough and that other things need to be done, but that just shows you the real power of this working together. The 2008 worldwide crash, one of the big banks that caused the crash, that Ian used to be a senior economist for, was bailed out by the UK taxpayer, that pooling and sharing of resources. Let's articulate our shared identity. Scots, Welsh, Northern Irish and English are no different in terms of the social attitude survey. In fact, almost identical, with the exception of one thing. Over the last 2 or 3 surveys, Scots have been slightly more right-wing than any other nation in the country on immigration. You wouldn't have thought that. Let's articulate that shared identity about dealing with inequality, about poverty, whether or not we want to be looking at those big institutions that we all hold dear in the United Kingdom, the monarchy, the BBC, the National Health Service, our education system. These are the things that we can celebrate. And let's strengthen devolution. This is an English problem, actually, but let's strengthen devolution. Let's strengthen local government. Let's strengthen local communities. So identity and populist politics are sweeping across mature democracies right across the world. We've seen that in the US, and they're just coming out of it. And now we need to find a way of making sure that that identity in populist politics doesn't rip up the United Kingdom and throw the baby out the bathwater. I'm going to let Ian intervene because I see he's got his hand up, even though he didn't let me in on him, but I'm generous that way.
Yeah, generous. You're generous to fault, and I thank the honourable gentleman for that. I'm listening to Ian with admiration as he goes through his list. But you know, one of the things, Ian, when you and I remember 2014, and we were told that the vow was going to be put in place after that we were going to get home rule in the spirit of Keir Hardie. That Scotland, we were told by David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, we were to lead the UK. It was going to be a partnership of equals. None of that has happened. Scotland's voice has been disrespected, certainly when it comes to the European Union. And the fact is that the ship has sailed on many of the ideals that Ian is talking about. But you asked specifically the question about currency, and I'll give you the answer to that, and that is that we'll be keeping the pound until and as such time as 6 economic tests have been met that would allow us then to develop our own currency. But what's key, because often people talk about currency, I mean, that is a bill of exchange, it's a note of paper that you have in your pocket. What's important is the fiscal powers that you have to create jobs. And I didn't talk about us not being able to prosper under the Union. What I talked about was a relative decline, which is best shown by the fact that so many people have had to leave. And I want us to get back to a situation that we can live in peace and prosperity with all those in these islands, the peace and prosperity that you see between Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. But to do that from Scotland having the dignity and self-respect to being an independent country, but one that's at peace with itself and at peace with its identity as a member of the European Union.
Well, that was a very lengthy question, Mr. President. Let me answer that, because I don't know if it was a point of information or just another addition to Ian Blackford's first speech, but there was nothing in the vow that wasn't delivered. That was put together by the 5 parties on a cross-party basis that made the Scottish Parliament the second most powerful devolved parliament in the world. And I wish Ian would use some of those powers in order to tackle poverty and inequality in Scotland. And that Ian's just told us the currency tonight. We're going to have sterlingization, which means we're going to try and join the euro without taking on the euro, using someone else's currency. And could you imagine what would have happened had 2014 come to pass? It would have been 5 years through a decade of using the pound, someone else's currency, with someone else's central bank, having no way of being able to deal with borrowing, the kind of borrowing that's required to deal with COVID. A total and utter economic travesty. And Ian's going to smile because he knows it, and he's pulling the wool over people's eyes in terms of trying to deliver it. So, Mr. President, let me finish by saying this. This is why I'm against the proposition. Let's reimagine and re-energise the country, the United Kingdom, while celebrating our own individual identities and our individual patriotism for the 4 nations of this United Kingdom. But let's not allow those that seek to divide to do irreversible damage to those that live on these islands and our family of nations. Our people are united. It's our politics that isn't. That needs to change. And as a devolutionist, I want to change that, but I want to change it by keeping our 4 nations together. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your speech. Christine, I noticed you've had your hand up for a while. Did you want to make an interjection? No. Okay. In which case, we shall move on to our second speaker for the side proposition, David Melding. David is the MS for South Wales Central. He has been a vocal critic of the government's recent approach to negotiations with the European Union. In September 2020, he quit his role in the Shadow Front Bench in opposition to the proposal in the Internal Market Bill. David, you have our ears.
Thank you, Freddie. And what the other members may not realise from that introduction is that I'm a Tory to boot, but I'm a very disgruntled unionist, and it's in that vein I speak this evening. Well, the union we call the United Kingdom was perhaps anticipated in 1536, was formed in 1707, added to in 1801, reduced in 1921, and radically altered following the advent of devolution in 1999. My apologies, Stormont. We have to live with anomalies. The only question, I think now, is whether unionism, through this incredible change, has enough creative energy to forge a new union, as I hope it does, but I suspect it might not. As Edmund Burke might have put it, the state of our present discontent should not surprise us. It has been driven by Firstly, devolution turning out in practice to be more volatile than the federalism it sought to avoid. Secondly, the peculiar acceptance of secession in British political thought and the consequences of that. Thirdly, Brexit and the emergence of European unionism. Fourthly, the rise of political nationalism, most notably in Scotland, but most recently in England. And finally, the failure to reform the union and infuse it with unionist statecraft fit for the 21st century. I shall speak to most of these points, but not all, as some have already been covered by Ian, though not with the purpose of strengthening the case for a new union. Devolution is not federalism, and Ian Murray has already hinted at in his praise of devolution. But I do think it has been a dangerous entity. It's tried to sort of give radical decentralization without undermining Westminster sovereignty. And we have in the United Kingdom, despite inventing parliamentary federalism, a great antipathy to its use in the United Kingdom, based, it seems, on the inability of Westminster to function effectively, should it be conceded. But I'm sure some of you have watched Hamilton, I was going to say the movie, but I mean the opera. And you will know that Alexander Hamilton, the father of modern federalism, his intention was to create a central government. It was not actually a scheme of decentralization. Decentralization was the price he was willing to pay, but he saw the need through federalism to give authority to a central government. And it seems to me that that's the tipping point we're at, only we may not have the insight. The division of sovereignty is actually a very effective way of guaranteeing sovereignty of the central authority. And it prevents encroachment over all sorts of matters, from borrowing powers to defense, nuclear arms, for instance, that occurs from sub-states that may argue against some of these policies, despite not really having a constitutional right to intervene. The Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament were from the start very powerful entities. They're far more powerful than most federal institutions in federal states across the world. Again, you know, it was a peculiar part of the design of decentralization in the British state in the 1990s to give such powerful institutions, but not to provide the girdle of federalism and a written constitution that could have set those in a more controlled and constructive orbit. It really was a very, very misguided, in my view, decision that was taken at that time, though for pragmatic reasons, perhaps one can understand it to some extent. England, the London Assembly apart, was left out of the project entirely, and that has now come back to haunt the British Constitution. And in the 20 years since, or more, since the advent of devolution, we've not really moved forward to a more federal, if not constitution, then use of more federal mechanisms. And this has exposed the United Kingdom to serious constitutional risk. Let me just say a few words about our acceptance of secession. Before I do that, does Christine wish to intervene? I'm sorry. You have a lingering hand that's on the screen, so it's now been removed. If I turn then to the acceptance of secession, this is exceptionally rare in the international community. In fact, I'm at a loss to think of another democratic state that has our permissive attitude. It is particularly hazardous given the lack of a federal written constitution, which at least could provide some rules for the game if we were to have a referendum. Alas, if there is an Indy Ref 2, which broadly I would support if the SNP have a mandate to call it or ask for it following the parliamentary elections. But we could just face the sort of process we had with Brexit, which was a very difficult and process, because it just did not allow the development of an argument and for a gradual approach to the ultimate decision. Do you really want to leave now that some of the details have been filled in and the concept explored? Also, the acceptance of secession inevitably means the independence question is liable to appear in each generation unless there is a strong constitutional settlement commanding widespread support. And we clearly have not had that for a variety of reasons, which I won't rehearse now, but following 2014. More positively, the acceptance of secession, of course, requires any union to be a true partnership of equals, because the members are at liberty to leave that union should they wish. And that is quite a deterrent against overwhelming use of central authority, potentially. Brexit and European unionism has been dealt with by Ian Blackford. But all I would say from a unionist point of view is note how today nationalists in Scotland and Wales can claim not to be narrow separatists because European unionism is available to them. I do want to just talk about the rise of political nationalism. The most remarkable thing, in my view, about the 2014 referendum is that 45% of the Scottish people voted for independence. But we unionists ended up regarding it as an endorsement possibly for generations to come. And of course, within 2 years, a significant part of that prospectus, namely remaining in the EU in a double union, was radically changed. Not unreasonably, in my view, many English voters have started to ask why they do not have similar rights to autonomy over their matters. And this, at some level, has also fueled quite a pungent form of English nationalism. The Greater London Assembly was established, and it is something of a devolved institution. It wasn't even as strong as the National Assembly in Wales, but it probably is best seen in that light. It was a peculiar decision just to establish a London Assembly, as if London needed great protection from Westminster, but there we are, because Westminster is there. And cities like Manchester and Liverpool didn't need similar political rights. But it is interesting to note how in the last 20 years, one of the most positive signs about devolution, there have been a couple, is that regions and cities of England have started to look at this through their regional authorities and their elected mayors. And then in terms of the rise of nationalism, and much less constructively, we have seen emerge a sort of muscular unionism growing out of Brexit, which basically says, you know, the people of Scotland need a good talking to. They should realise all the benefits of the union, and we should shout out the message very, very clear. Now, there are a lot of transactional reasons that I think give that approach some strength, but of course, emotionally, it doesn't work. And I'm afraid I do regard it as a sort of badge and bark unionism, which at its worst can be seen almost as a form of English foreign policy, rather than the true desire to have a united kingdom. Finally, I just want to say that there's been an alarming absence of unionist statecraft for several years. Where is the offer that was promised in 2014 and repeated in a fashion, it has to be said, in the Conservative Manifesto of 2019? Well, you know, let's face facts. We unionists have not even managed to reform the House of Lords, reform that's been promised and imminent since 1911. And since 1999, it's been crying out for a function. And that function could easily be the Senate of the Nations, given as the responsibility of the Constitution and the reformed union, one could argue. But we have not even done that. And of course, there is, whether we like it or not, a looming crisis in Scotland. Just say no to Indy Ref 2? For how long? 25 years? It's gone up to 45 years recently. Of course, we did this through the Irish Parliamentary Party in the late 19th century and repeatedly ignored the fact that 80% of the Irish people voted for that party, and we just denied them home rule time in, time out. I do not think that just saying no is an option. We do need to come up with an alternative. And the only way I think the union can be saved in that scenario, not then it will work out, the parliamentary elections in Scotland are yet to take place. And the SNP is in some considerable turmoil at the moment. But whether that emotionally will affect the argument, I'm not so sure. The political factors are weaker than some people realize. That an axial point in the population makes fundamental changes in its political, in its constitutional outlook. But the only way to resolve matters would be to propose a Union Ref 1 to deflect Indie Ref 2 and tell the people of Scotland how we intend genuinely to reform the United Kingdom so they, together with Wales, can be full partners in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your speech. We have one student question for you from Owen McCardle. Owen says, you describe yourself as one of the last unionists. Doesn't this reflect the fact that the opportunity has passed to reform the UK in a way that pleases all its component nations? Particularly if Brexit is driving the breakup of the UK, no federal government allows some parts of the UK and some parts to be in the EU and some parts to be outside. That ends with a question mark.
Well, I should say I have a hashtag called the last of the unionists, because in my view, some of the very hard questions before us are not being faced, and obviously there are legitimate views on that, and many people don't agree with me from within my own party. But I do believe at heart the question we face is, as unionists, will we accept change, including some difficult and radical change, to forge a new union, or will we get it as badly wrong as our Edwardian ancestors did in relation to Ireland, and they ended up driving them out of the union, and I fear Scotland could go the same way.
Thank you, David, and thank you to our student who submitted the question. We will now move on to our second speaker for the opposition. Our second speaker is Christine Jardine. Christine is the MP for Edinburgh West and the Liberal Democrat spokeswoman for the Treasury, Trade and Exiting the European Union. She currently sits on the Scottish Affairs Committee in Westminster. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I repeat the thanks that have already been given to you all for holding this evening, and for making the effort to continue life as normal, as close as normal, particularly for students. It's very disrupted as we can in this pandemic. And actually, I think this pandemic and our behaviour in this pandemic is the very first thing which undermines the motion before us tonight. Because we have behaved not as four separate communities, four different viewpoints, four different identities. We have worked together. Now, I know the nationalists would say that, oh, well, Boris Johnson's come up with a plan for England, you know, the Welsh have got their own plan and we've got our own plan, the First Minister. Yes, but they do it together, because you don't have to have just one voice to be repeating something, to be laying out a plan. If you have the same basic plan for all four nations, then you're doing it together, in unity. More than that, the people of the United Kingdom have reacted in unity. They supported Sir Captain Tom Moore in unison. They clapped on a Thursday night for the NHS and for carers in unison. And they have worked together in this. So I appreciate that Mr. Blackford is better acquainted with disunity at the moment, probably than most of us, and that disunity is the aim and the raison d'etre of his political party. But I'm afraid what I see in the United Kingdom at the moment is not disunity, it's common purpose. And I think some of us, those of us who believe in the United Kingdom, are becoming a little tired of nationalist politicians whose aim is to separate us from the rest of the United Kingdom, turning up in Westminster and misrepresenting the situation in Scotland to Westminster. They tell us what a wonderful job the Scottish Government is doing. But they don't tell us about the crisis in Scottish education, the fact that the NHS in Scotland is struggling, and that we have had 14 years of mismanagement in Scotland. No, they don't tell us that. But neither do they represent Westminster properly to Scotland. They don't tell the people in Scotland that Westminster is not separate, apart from Scotland. Scotland and Westminster work together. And at Westminster, there are Scottish MPs, 54 of them are from the SNP. We are there to represent Scotland in the United Kingdom, as part of the United Kingdom, to make sure Scotland's voice is heard. And I have to say to Mr. Blackford, if Scotland's voice is not being heard, then it's the fault of the SNP, because they are the ones with the greatest volume of Scots at Westminster. But I believe it is being heard. And I believe our representation is there. We are integral to Westminster. Over the past 20 years, we have had 2 Scots-born Prime Ministers, 2 Scottish Chancellors, a Prime Minister whose father was Scottish. And next week, when the Chancellor stands to present his budget, the 3 opposition statements will come from Scottish women. I'm sorry, but that does not really sound to me like a parliament. It's very diverse, and we have differences, but we are not disunited. And I want to remain part of that, because I believe in Scotland's ability. I believe in Scotland's ability to make a success of the United Kingdom. It has done so. It has served us well for the past 300 years. Collaboration, cooperation. Is that not what we celebrate and call for in every other walk of life? When you send your child to school, when you all went to university, did your parents say to you, only speak to the people at the table beside you? Only speak to anyone who comes from your street? No, they didn't, because they did not want to limit your growth and ambition. You would not do the same with your children. Well, it's the same for Scotland. Moreover, it's precisely the objection which the nationalists, which would rip us out of the United Kingdom, made to us having left the European Union. Leaving an economic union does not solve having left an economic union. But then there is the other argument which we hear employed, and you'll hear the dog agrees with me. Scotland did not vote for this Tory government. Some of Scotland did, but also some of Scotland, quite a substantial proportion of Scotland, did not vote for this SNP government, which we have, a minority government at Holyrood. But you know, that is democracy, and I accept it, because every few years an election gives us the opportunity to decide again, to change our minds. Leaving the United Kingdom would not give us that opportunity. Leaving the European Union has not given us that opportunity. And there is one other significant difference between the European Union and the United Kingdom. The European Union was an economic convenience for both the United Kingdom and for the European Union. It was a cooperative arrangement between friends, allies. The United Kingdom is a family. We are all related to one another in one way or another. I recently did a DNA test, expecting it to come back and say that my family had always come from the west of Scotland. No, a lot of my family have come from the west of Scotland. But there were also huge proportion of my origins were from Northumbria, Wales, Scandinavia. My grandmother was half English on one side, and my other grandmother was half Irish. So I'm sorry, the United Kingdom is made up of constituent parts, but those constituent parts are not entirely separate. So for me, the SNP and the Nationalists pick and choose the unity that they want. Across the channel is fine, but the ground that they stand on, the land that we share, is not. Surely now more than ever, we realise that there's nothing different from someone from Cardiff to Carlisle to Coldstream. We can't vaccinate against bad government, certainly, but we can recognise them and vote them out at the next election. We can't undo nationalism. And you know what, as I've listened to the repetitive debate which always comes from the nationalists. I realise that I've also become tired of this vision of British politics, which, as I said, neither recognises nor acknowledges Britain's, Scotland's contribution to the United Kingdom. Mr. Blackford said that you can take any decade in the relationship and Scotland will not have benefited. As Mr. Murray said, that is fundamentally incorrect. If you look at the history of the United Kingdom over the past 200-300 years, and you look at the great institutions, you will find that there was more than 10% were in the leading offices of the East India Company, of the Army, of the BBC, and as I said earlier, of government. I watched the other night a documentary about my old friend and someone who taught me a great deal about politics and the attitude to it. Charles Kennedy had a way of saying that our identity is not one thing. Our identity is made up of a lot of different elements. He was a Highlander, a Scot, British, and European. And all of those elements of his identity were equally important to him. They all made up who he was. Well, I feel very much the same. I'm a lowland Scot, but I'm a Scot. I'm British and I'm a European. And over the past few years, that part of my identity that is European has been taken away from me. But I will not allow, without the fiercest of fights, that part of my identity which is British, that part of my family which is British, and that family that I am part of which is British, to be undermined by the false argument that we are not one people, disparate, diverse, of course, politically different, yes, but 300 years of economy, 300 years of politics, 300 years of campaigning, of unfortunately fighting wars across the globe have given us common purpose, common cause, and unity. And when I look out in this crisis, that is what I see again. Unity, common purpose, not disunity and separatism, but a united kingdom.
Thank you very much, Christine, for a stirring speech. We shall now move on to our third speaker for the proposition. Our third speaker is the Right Honourable Simon Hughes. Simon is the former MP for Bermondsey and Old Southwark and former President and Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats. He served as Minister of State for Justice and Civil Liberties during the Coalition and is now the Chancellor of the London South Bank University. Simon is also an alumnus of Selwyn College. The floor is yours.
Mr. President and friends, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. It's an honour and a privilege to join you. It's been a little while since I've been on such a platform, your platform. Apologies for the sort of facial winter warmer here, which isn't a disguise, but is a result of lockdown, I think. And I am really pleased that we don't have to dress up in a DJ. And I'm not so sad that I have to put a DJ on for my special night in at the moment. So I hope we're all in a comfortable state. It's lovely to follow my friend Christine, who I haven't seen in person for a ridiculously long time, such has been the effect, and much look forward. I'm a big Christine fan. It was really good to hear David. David, we must speak, because I think our views are extraordinarily common. It must be our common Welsh heritage, as well as our common view about the issue. Mr. President, I have no idea how many people are watching, but I know you have good audiences, so I'm going to speak to the audience out there as one of the most discerning and intelligent audiences capable of being united together anywhere in the UK, at least in theory, I hope in practice. And I believe that your vote, audience, on this motion should not be a difficult decision. The motion says this House believes the kingdom is no longer united. I don't think this is a case for a not proven verdict on the motion. I hope and believe that when you vote, you'll conclude the evidence is overwhelming, but the case for the motion is overwhelming. and that the facts show beyond any reasonable doubt that the kingdom is, whatever we might wish, no longer united. And if I may say gently, whatever the charm and beguiling arguments of my lovely friend Christine and her naysayer colleagues, they should be overwhelmingly rejected. And she'll forgive you if you vote against her. Don't worry about that. There will be no retribution. So feel free to do so. So I'm going to be, just for a moment, a bit like your tutor or supervisor and give you 3 warnings about what the task is ahead. Please answer the question that's been set, is the heading for the 3 warnings. Warning 1, please don't feel that by voting for us, you're endorsing or supporting the SNP or Plaid or United Ireland. You're not. Intriguingly, you're supporting a coalition of SNP, Tory and Liberal Democrat. That's a rare beast, so it probably is worthy of some support. Don't feel also, if you're a Conservative sympathiser watching or a Labour sympathiser watching, that you're committing yourself to a new political cause if you vote for us, though of course New Liberal Democrats are always welcome. But on the hard conclusions of the argument, not either on the beauty or political allegiance of those of us who are its advocates. Secondly, you must vote not on what you want to be true, but what is true, however much you might, which is 100% my position. Unlike Ian Blackford, I believe in and support the United Kingdom. Truly, madly, deeply. I was born in England, lived and went to school in England and Wales, and have strong family roots, obviously a bit like Christine, in many places. England, Wales. I know all 3 British nations very well, and Northern Ireland very well, and I love them all, though during 6 nations not equally. And if you're wondering, the answer to that question is Welsh. I have my daffodil jumper on the top to prove it. And I want the UK to pull through its latest crisis of confidence. And thirdly, just because the SNP appears to be, as others have said, a bit more than a bit disunited itself, that's not a reason for opposing the motion. Now, I don't want to go over David's ground in detail, but I'll do it in a sort of quick, horrible histories way, if I may. You people in Cambridge, predecessors of the Cambridge Angles, joined with the other 4 lots just over 1,000 years ago. Then in 1200, you annexed us Welsh, the clue's in my name, you built lovely castles, and you sealed the deal under Henry VIII. The thought of being anything under Henry VIII is a bit horrible, but anyway, I pass over. Then in about 1700, we became Great Britain when England and Wales got together with Scotland. About 1800, we collected the last island in the set to become for the first time the United Kingdom. And about 120 years later, our little island collective had become the most extensive empire the world had ever known. Not bad, eh? Then splits appeared. 100 years ago this May, in fact. The 32 green bits split 26-6, and in 1927 became UK, THB, and NI. Pretty recent, really, in the course of history. Then, as David reminded us, in 1999, the Northern Ireland Assembly first, then the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate all popped up. What about the English, you cry? Very good question. And as David hinted, in my view, if we had had a parliament for England from then too, probably we would not have had Brexit, and probably now less disunited kingdom. And I've always been one of those arguing in our party that we should have gone down that road. Not a federal United Kingdom with all the regions of England equal to the countries, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but a federal United Kingdom where the MPs from England sat as English MPs for some of the time and as UK MPs for others of the time, and they, the MPs for England, decided on the regional structure of England. If we'd gone down that road, I think we would definitely not have been the mess we're in. And certainly, if we'd been sensible, like Switzerland, going back many hundreds of years, India, Australia, Canada, the USA, thank God now more sensible, Germany, though they had no choice, and others, had we gone federal, we would not be in this mess. And it's probably now the only way of rescuing the UK. Who knows, a British Isles Federation might even be attractive in Dublin one day too. That's the next episode of Horrible Histories. So now on to a few stats. UK general elections. 1951, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, nationalists, total 1 MP, 0.3% of the UK vote, general election in 51. 1983, when I was first elected, nationalists in all 3 countries of the UK outside England, 5 MPs in total, 1.8% of the UK vote at the general election. 2019, the last election, 59 nationalist MPs in those 3 countries, 5% of the vote in the UK general election. Over the same period, in Scotland, the percentage of the vote for nationalists went from 0.3% to 45%. In Wales, from 0.7% to 10%. Interestingly, it had always been pretty strong, Sinn Féin and the Republicans in Northern Ireland, so the increase there was less, 20 to 23%. Last 2 bits of stats. Brexit, Scotland remain, as Ian above all will know, but we all know, Scotland remains 2%, Northern Ireland remain 56%, clearly different, clearly disunited in the view from Wales. The Labour independents supported Scotland, opinion poll today actually, by Ipsos Mori, 52%, Wales mostly 22%, and those in favour of United Ireland 42%. And just en passant, as they say, in the United Kingdom Parliament, the number of take-back control MPs are nil point. A few facts, or as an American former senior statesperson would have said, known and unknowns. And this touches on the Christine point. Still all shared and therefore united issues. Yes, the monarchy. Yes, the BBC. Yes, the NHS. Yes, the Thursday claps, Christine. Yes, the supporting Tom Moore, Christine. Yes, driving on the left, at least most people do. Yes, 11 government departments, well, they're sort of united, discussion arms, the Supreme Court, and British Airways. Never all shared and united, the established church, the judicial systems, education and higher education, weather, accents, and radio listening. Were all shared and now not united, tuition fees, tax rates, 9 government departments, British Rail, and may I say, to Christine, public health, where in response to the pandemic, it wasn't the same in all 4 countries, as I know, to my cost and others, with family in Wales and currently me living in England. And probably most recently, which was shared but not altogether united, is, as you will have seen, the number 10 unit specially set up to keep the union together, where Oliver Lewis was appointed as the boss in the first week of February 2021 and resigned in the 3rd week of February 2021. Something a bit disunited there. And then were not shared and are now united. I don't hear the voices clamouring to give an answer to that. I don't think there's anything that has been moving in the other direction, was separate and is now together. Oh, and before you mention it, I forgot sport. True, the Olympics and the Davis Cup and the America's Cup team are all UK, though strangely, they're all called GB, not UK. The Rugger Bugger Lions are UK plus Ireland, and the Six Nations has 4 teams from our islands, but one of them is a called United Ireland team, North-South. Football, 4 national teams. Cricket, 3, if you didn't know, England and Wales are 1, Scotland and Ireland are 2 separate ones. And golf, of course, we don't have a UK team because we need to be all of Europe to be able to beat the Americans. So, mesdames, messieurs et autres, you get my drift. This kingdom or queendom of ours is clearly drifting or falling apart. Some want us to pull further apart. Some want us to find a way to keep us together. This could all reach a sorry end in the next 10 years. David Cameron and Boris Johnson, look what you have done to us. Not united with mainland Europe, not united within our own boundaries. In this life or the next, you both will have to answer for this. But if you want to join me, good people, in saving the Union, then, Mr. President, you fix a date when we can meet in the Union Bar, and we will gather to plot the revolution to do that, or in the Selwyn College Bar, where you'd be very welcome. But in the meantime, whatever you want, we must start by telling it as it is. The kingdom is today no longer united. Face reality, and please, intellectually and emotionally, vote overwhelmingly for the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your speech. We haven't got a question from you from our student audience, but I believe Ian, who's been waiting patiently with his hand, may have a POI, so I'll pass over to Ian.
Apologies, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. President. And my point of information for Simon is he reeled off essentially the general election history since 1950, but surely accepts two things from that. One is that there was a rise of nationalism in the 70s, which disappeared. And also the rise of nationalism and populism isn't unique, particularly in this generation, to the United Kingdom. It's on the rise all over the world. This isn't a United Kingdom problem as such in terms of the rise of nationalism, although we see it here, we live through it here, it's very acute here. It's a rise of nationalism across the whole, I would say, the Western world, but maybe even much wider than that. And secondly, there has to be some kind of recognition that this is a political problem rather than being a union problem. And you said that, yes, David Cameron and yes, Boris Johnson will have a lot to answer for when history is written, but also, of course, the Liberal Democrats made sure during that coalition period that we had that referendum on Europe, and look at where it's got us now. So there has to be some recognition that this is political and not, in this sense, the wider issue of breaking up the union.
Ian, Mr. President, Ian, thank you very much. We've never had the pleasure of debating across the floor of the Chamber of the House of Commons, so this gives us a chance quickly. I'll reply quickly to your questions. You're right that nationalism since the 50s in Wales and Scotland has risen and then dropped back, but it's risen again since then. And in Scotland, it's been higher more recently than it was in its first peak in the 70s. And I remember the first SNP by-election victories and the like. In Wales, it's risen and it's been consistent in its number of MPs who have been elected. Plaid have got up to 4 and they've stayed at 4. So it hasn't either receded or leapt ahead. And in Northern Ireland, as I indicated earlier, it's crept up, but there are more people, certainly since Brexit, supporting United Ireland. Obviously, the issues are slightly different in Northern Ireland for obvious reasons. Secondly, you're completely right, Mr. President, Ian's completely right that this is not a UK phenomenon, but we're not debating whether the UK is different from other countries. It is an issue, but to say it's not a constitutional issue and it's only a political issue, they come together. And as David rightly argued, I think in his earlier speech, if the government had been ahead of the game and thinking about these things, if we'd had a proper constitutional convention, if we designed a constitution for the UK, if we'd had a constitutional referendum on a constitution of the UK, then we could have anticipated and dealt with that. It's by failing to deal with it. And we have suffered by being terribly British and being entirely pragmatic and dealing with the Irish problem or not in the 19th century, and then realizing we had to deal with it in a way that wasn't very satisfactory. Then dealing with, I remember Donald Dewar response when Scotland clearly was knocking hard the door, Parliament long before I got there, when there was the vote in the House of Commons on the original plan for devolution for Scotland. So we've had a bit of devolution here, a bit there, a bit somewhere else, and that's been the failure. And the fact that in Spain or in other places this tide is rising, India, is true. On the last point, Ian, I hate to tell you this, but I saw Christine agreeing with what I'm about to say, even though she didn't know what I was going to say. You can blame Liberal Democrats for going into the coalition with the Tories. I never expected to be in bed with them in my life, but there you go. the numbers with Labour didn't add up, as you know, and many Labour people didn't want to do a coalition. And had we left the Tories to run the country on their own, that would have been considerably worse. They would have then called, because in those times they had the power to go to call a referendum, call a general election. We would have had a Tory majority government, in my view, far worse. We did not allow a referendum. We absolutely blocked a referendum, and there was the reason Cameron is thought to have written, if you look at his memoirs and other people's books, written the commitment in the 2015 Tory manifesto to the referendum was to keep his troops happy, personally believing that he wouldn't have a majority, we would stop him doing it. And I can assure you, because I was there in that 10 to 15 Parliament, that had there, Mr. President, been a proposal for a referendum, colleagues of mine, all my colleagues, I believe, would have voted against it because we did not believe that that was the right way to resolve the issues. But Ian, we can pursue these matters on a later date. And Mr. President, your august viewers and undergraduates all around Cambridge or sitting around the country, wherever they are, perhaps even further afield, can enjoy this debate later on.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Simon. We'll now move on to our final speaker for the night, and the third speaker for the opposition. The speaker is Andrew Bowie. Andrew is the MP for West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine since 2017, when he was unseated by the incumbent Scottish Nationalist MP. Andrew currently serves as the Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party. Andrew, you have our ears.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and it's with great pleasure that I sum up the opposition to the motion before us this evening, and not only that, but urge everyone watching this evening to reject it outright. You see, I attest that this kingdom is not only united today, but that it will remain so for many, many years to come. Ian and Christine have given very stout defences, although I would take slight issue with Ian's characterisation or his description of the current Conservative government, but that debate is for another evening at a different time. But Ian and Christine have given great practical arguments as to why this kingdom is united. And I want to take a different tack. I am a Scot. I was born in Scotland and educated in Scotland, and now I have the immense privilege to represent the northeast of Scotland, my home in the House of Commons, and I happen to believe it's the best part of the best country in the world. But I am also a Brit, and incredibly proud to be so. Tonight I speak to you virtually in Cambridge, one of the great educational institutions of the world, a globally recognised, international, but decidedly British institution. And I am proud to say that you are of my country. I'm not speaking to a foreign centre of academic excellence, as international and diverse as this audience may be tonight. I am at home in my country, speaking the common language we all share, with the values and courtesies we all recognise in a manner befitting the democratic principles that we know and we defend, our values, our language, and our democracy. That, for me, is the greatness of our United Kingdom. We are four peoples in one, the British, a hodgepodge of backgrounds and identities, but with shared values. We can be proud Scots, Welsh, Northern Irish, English. We can be proud Londoners or Aberdonians, Yorkshiremen, Lancastrians, Muslim, Christian, Hindu. You can be a mixture of all of the above and still be British. And that is the beauty of our brilliantly confused melting pot of a country. It's what makes us who we are. And it saddens me, actually more than that, it is heartbreaking to hear people talk of the breakup of this nation, my home, as if they are speaking of nothing more than the end of a business relationship, a trading agreement. As if the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland represents nothing more than a corporate business economic agreement or arrangement between four distinct and separate nations. Of course, the economic and business relationships between the home nations is deep and vitally important, not least to the millions of people who rely on the continuation of the UK's internal markets for their jobs, their income, and their security. But it is more than that. This country, my country, the United Kingdom, is about the familial ties all across these nations. It is about the shared history and our shared values that together we stood up for over the last century and more. Because this is the country together that abolished slavery, that fought with our allies to free the world from oppression, from Nazism, from communism, helped found the European Court of Human Rights, the United Nations and NATO, and has stood as a beacon for the poor and the dispossessed of the world, as a symbol of hope that good will forever overcome evil. I will never forget one hazy summer's evening, must be about 14 years ago, being on board HMS Edinburgh, having crossed the Atlantic from Brazil. We were sailing slowly into the English Channel, and it must have been July. The sky was that glorious reddy blue magenta colour you only see at the end of a really hot summer's day when you were down by the coast. I was on the upper deck and looking across a sea that was flat calm, and just visible through the fine mist was the Cornish coast. I could almost taste the Penzance fish and chips. And I remember thinking to myself that that's my coast, that's my home. And as long as there remains breath in my body, that is what this country will remain. Very often you hear the United States of America described as the great experiment. But to my mind, the original great experiment, launched 70 years before the Bostonians decided, inexplicably, to chuck what was by all accounts perfectly drinkable tea into the ocean, was ours, the experiment of the United Kingdom. And as with any experiment, you change and you adapt the processes in order to achieve the desired outcome. In this case, a country diverse and different, united and at peace with itself. And in 314 years, in an attempt to succeed, as Simon Hughes has eloquently explained this evening, we have seen the shape of our union change and evolve. We have seen the systems of government adapt and develop in order to achieve what the Americans would describe as a more perfect union. And you know what, actually, I do have to admit, as I talk to you tonight, we do seem quite far from achieving that. But unlike David Melding, I haven't lost hope. And I don't think we should stop trying. It is the duty of all of us to strive to improve our United Kingdom. For if an island, this small island in the North Sea, with so many ties, with so much in common, cannot stay united, what signal does that send to the rest of the sorely divided world? This is the exciting challenge that we all have. And what a challenge, what an opportunity. Inheriting the struggle from the shoulders of giants like the great Donald Dewar, who himself described devolution as a journey, we can make this country work for all its people. It is a matter of demonstrable fact that this country achieves much more together than it ever could apart. You only need to look at the incredible pace and success of the COVID vaccine rollout to see that. Why would we want to put that at risk? Why would we want to create a border where there has been none for over 300 years? That is the depressing vision of the nationalists. That is the defeatist attitude of those who look on our union as a mistake or as a remnant of history. That is the sorry analysis of those who cannot believe that our future can in fact think of the Wales and Northern Ireland, comfortable and happy for the most part, but shaken sometimes when one of the family tries something new or admits to wanting to do something different. It takes a while for the family to get used to the idea, but eventually when it does, it makes for a better, more rounded situation. That, I think, is the United Kingdom experimenting with devolution in 2021. The United Kingdom, imperfect, certainly. Failed, certainly not. Unfinished, probably. United, yes. And we are determined to make it work even better. To admit that we can't adapt, to admit that our great experiment of maintaining our union has failed, to break up this nation simply because we are uncomfortable with one of the constituent parts doing its own thing, doing something differently, that would be the easy way out. Democracy is difficult. Maintaining this union is difficult, but we must persevere. Does that mean trying new things, again, changing how we do it, adapting our process to achieve a more perfect result? Maybe. We shouldn't be afraid of that. The unwritten constitution of our United Kingdom is not some museum piece stuck in aspic, incapable of flexibility or radical thought. From its earliest days, quite simply because it is by its nature unwritten, it has been able to adapt, flex and change with the pressures, challenges and demands of the times we have found ourselves in. And unlike Mr. Blackford, I am an optimist. I believe we can do it. With imagination, with courage, with determination, we can build that better union and we can complete this experiment. This kingdom is united, and working together, we can unite it still further. And that is why I oppose the motion this evening and ask everyone voting tonight to vote against it, to accept that this union has its faults, that it can be improved, but that at its heart, this kingdom remains united and will remain so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your speech. We don't have any questions from the audience, but it looks like Ian Blackford has a question or a POI. So I will let Ian close and you have a right to reply.
Thank you, Freddie. I mean, I just wanted to sort of say to Andrew that I think, unfortunately, a lot of the problems that are encapsulated in the motion are the problems that have been created by the UK government. And it's interesting, if I can say to Andrew, that there have been many situations over the course of the recent past where the administration in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast have stood together, for example, against the powers contained in the UK Single Market Act. And that principle, Andrew, of London, Westminster, dictating to the devolved administrations and ignoring the concept of Sewell, which was about not legislating without the consent of the parliaments. And of course, there is the get out that's in that. We all know that about situations not being normal. But it's the issue of not being able to work with those administrations, Andrew, that causes a lot of the problem. And I think Simon's argued the case very cogently for those that believe in the union to be able to define that unionism in the context of things that are changing. It's not for me to do that, it's for others to do that. But the situation that you're in, that Ian's in, that Christine is in, that I am in, if you believe in the union, for the first time over the course of the last few years, you and I are excluded from certain votes in the House of Commons because of English votes for English laws. So unionism has found itself in a degree of difficulty in coming to terms with what devolution means, and then ending up in a situation that effectively we've got two different classes of MPs at Westminster.
Christine, I know you're raising your hand. I'm going to take one speaker for the opposition. So Andrew, you can either give way to Christine, or Andrew, you can reply to this one.
As much as I'd like to give way to Christine, because she looks like she's about to burst through the screen, as animated as she is, I'll hold on to this one. Firstly, just to say, English votes for English laws is an invidious piece of legislation that I completely disagree with and don't think it should be a statutory law, and actually has been suspended for the foreseeable future by the current government, because I don't believe the Prime Minister believes in it either. We all should be the same class of MP. We're all elected to the Sovereign Parliament of the United Kingdom. But the problem is that the heart of Ian Blackford's argument is that he believes that this country should be broken up because he disagrees with the colour of the government that's in power in Westminster right now. And I do not believe that you can base a campaign, base an argument for separatism, for the creation of a separate country, solely because you disagree with the policies of the incumbent government in London.
I believe that
I understand
various governments, Andrew.
Well, you probably disagreed with the previous incarnation of the UK government as well, Ian. Almost certainly you did. But so I take issue with the premise of the question. I think, as Christine said earlier on, if Scotland doesn't have a voice in the House of Commons, that's because Scottish MPs haven't been shouting loudly enough to make their voice heard. And right now in the House of Commons, the vast amount of Scottish MPs are from the Scottish National Party. So I would look to your own MPs and urge you to do much better at championing Scotland's position in the House of Commons if you have a problem with Scotland's voices being heard at Westminster.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Andrew. Christine, I'm sorry, but I think we're going to try and keep one speech on one side, one speech on the other side, and I'm conscious of time this evening, so we ought to draw our debate to a close. But thank you so much to all our 6 speakers on the call for making this such a lively event. I'm delighted that the spirit of vociferous Cambridge Union debates is continuing online, so thank you very much for helping us put that on. Just a plug for our upcoming events. We've got a busy couple of days. So we have tomorrow evening at 7:30, What Makes a Diversity Champion with Lord Chris Smith and Randy Bossonalt. That's tomorrow evening at 7:30. Then we have an interview with Elliot Higgins, the journalist, at 7 on Saturday night. And we are premiering our LGBTQ+ History Month video with Claire Balding, Stephen Fry, Peter Tatchell, and many others, including students from the university. That's premiering Sunday at 4. So do keep tuned. On the matter of the debate this evening, our poll is still open, so please feel free to vote if you haven't yet had your say. We'll be closing the vote in about 10 minutes, and you follow the results on our social media. Thank you very much again to all who participated in asking questions, and again to our speakers tonight. Have a lovely evening. Thank you and good night.